Hello, dear ones, and greetings from the Center for Contemporary Mysticism. My name is Joe Irwin, and it's a joy to gather with you again to explore this amazing journey that we share. We have a great program for you today, but first I'd like to officially welcome everyone, particularly new folks. If you're new to the center, be sure and check out our website, contemporarymysticism.org, where you'll find hundreds of different videos, resources, groups in which you may join and participate in different spiritual programs. So check that out. Remember, our goal here at the center is to be a partner with you. So if you feel what we're doing is important, we invite you to get involved, however you like. Support the center or get involved however you feel called and help us continue this work that we're doing together. So now it's a pleasure to welcome our guest of the day, the Reverend Peter Panagore. He is a United Church of Christ minister, an international best-selling author, a scholar of mysticism, we might say, and as you know by now, a two-time near-death experiencer. In fact, after his second near-death experience, I think in 2015, he realized that his faith and perspective on church had changed, and it's drawn him to a new focus of ministry that he's described as not church. I like that one, helping individuals move beyond just a belief in God to an actual experience of God. So welcome, Peter. It's truly an honor to have you with us. It's particularly an honor for me because back in the days of old, both Peter and I started out as a minister in the United Church of Christ. So it's always fun to run across closet mystics among our United Church of Christ brethren and sistren, and to see what they're up to. So it's a real special joy. And of course, we're joined by Patricia Pierce, whom you all know by now. She's our interviewer, an author, a former pastor, a spiritual teacher, and host a great podcast called the We Awakening Podcast. So we're so glad that you're here. We want to remind you that after Peter and Patricia dialogue for a while, we will have a Q&A. That's a big part of what we do. So you're able to come on and ask questions of Peter and or Patricia. You can click the raise your hand button. So I remind you that if you think of a question or a comment that you might like to share after our regular interview part, jot it down and make a note so that when we get to the Q&A session, you'll be ready to go. So now, Patricia and Peter, I'll turn it over to you, and you have a good dialogue, and then we'll all come back together a little bit further down the line.
Great. Thank you, Joe. So, Peter, I want to just reiterate what Joe was saying about how great it is to have you with us today. I've been looking forward to our conversation. And you are someone who has had mystical experiences since your childhood. And then the formative experience, of course, happened when you were, 21, when you had your first near-death experience, when you were ice climbing. And some people who are watching today may have heard you tell that story. If they haven't, you tell it very compellingly, both in your book, Heaven is Beautiful, and in your talks. And because we are limited on time and I want to just set the stage here, I would like to ask you to please describe for us. Well, so you were on this climb, ice climb, and there were equipment issues. You were delayed in your climb. You couldn't get back in time, and you died of hypothermia on the climb. When you died, what did you experience?
Just before I died, I experienced acceptance. I'd been driven all night long by this sort of mammalian or deep human need for survival. But when it came to the very end, I accepted the situation I was in, and a peace descended of acceptance. But as I died, the last experience of hypothermia is called tunnel vision, where it is what you think it is. When the tunnel vision started, I didn't know what was going on, and when it blacked out on me, I expected to have fallen asleep, but I didn't. I maintained consciousness, which was a surprise and a befuddlement for me, and because all of my pain was gone as well. and I didn't understand who I was other than the guy on the cliff. And where was I now? If I wasn't the guy on the cliff, how can I be a conscious and seemingly facing this darkness that was surrounding me from my front outward, but it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. So how could I possibly be who I was? What's going on? I was just confused. Really, I was just confused, and then this darkness became illuminated at a very great distance by a pinprick of light, and this light rapidly crossed this immense expanse. And as it came to me, it filled my vision, and it communicated to me telepathically, "I'm taking you." And I refused. I was like, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not going anywhere. And I put up my willpower, and it took me like I was a twig in a river, just plucked me away. And I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but I can summarize it if you want me to summarize.
Yeah, sure.
I can summarize by saying that I went through a hell of my own making. I suffered all the pain I'd given away in my life from the point of view of the other, from their interior. I was not judged. I judged myself for having caused this pain. But meanwhile, as I was experiencing these 2 points of view, the interior of these others, and my own point of view, the divine love was speaking to me interiorly and exteriorly, saying, "I love you. I made you. I've always known you." And this, I'd already gone through the light. I then experienced myself as my own, as my true self, without any physical form. I was much larger. My thinking was integrated with my identity, which was integrated with my senses, which was integrated with my knowledge. There was no separation between these things. And my identity was no longer Peter. My identity was a remembrance of my true self, that Peter was always a temporary thing, and that this that I am now was what I'd always been, but had forgotten under the now what I call a veil, which lots of people call that. I saw the origin of myself. I saw the length of my soul. I saw my reincarnations. I saw the multiplicity of the multiverse. I saw the depth of the divine being beyond conception. I experienced divine love inexpressible that was greater than all of these multiverses. I saw all of humanity with a golden light inside their hearts. I saw this radical equality of our brokenness and our divinity. I saw the divinity being the very core of our being that pre-exists our human selves in the divine outpouring of all creation as a portion of that. I was overwashed with love so extraordinary that I've never lost. I've never been lost ever since. And I chose to come back. I got to see my parents' lives with and without me. And although I was invited to stay, I chose to come back, and then I chose the life I was going to live. And it wasn't a linear life I chose. I chose a portal into a life that was then connected to all these other lives that I could have chosen from, all my lives. But some were closer to the light, and some were further, and I chose a life that was closer to the light. But I was offered the light itself and refused. I wanted some autonomy. And I've spent my entire life ever since trying to undo that choice.
Yeah, that's one of the things you talk about, and we'll get more into that, that you chose to come back because of relationships and responsibilities. And you felt like you needed to return. And we'll talk more about the challenge of that. When you were in this experience, you describe experiencing your true name when you were dead. Can you tell us, I mean, and I understand that like this is, words cannot convey it. And I know you've also spent many years working with words to convey it. So how could you help us see a glimmer or experience a glimmer of what that was like for you to be infilled and experience your true name?
Well, first, I'd like to say that everything that every mystic ever says is always in simile or metaphor, because there are literally or illiterally words, no words. This just can't be said. So I heard my name called. I heard the origin of my being. I experienced my original creation. My being called into being, my being breathed into being, my being worded. These are all metaphors, and my eternal nature rising from Creator, creating me as a particle, a separate subset of the divine, but also out of the divine. And this name, which is my soul. So this naming is not something that my soul is called. It is the essence of what I am. There's no separation between my being this orb of consciousness and this naming of myself, being named into being. They are one thing. Just there was so much unity there. And yet there was also this separation as well. I entered into a divine state of union where my soul, my consciousness, was expanded by the immense amount of light that infilled me, blew me up like a balloon. And so there was a limitation to me. There was a separation from infinity, but I was also infilled with the light of my own being, that which I was truly, absolutely always have been. And I describe this as beauty and love and joy, adoration, knowledge, understanding, but they were all integrated into one thing. And I was integrated into this one thing. This name that makes me exist is also all these things. And this name, it came back with me. It still it calls me from my interior, and it's like you're hearing your mom call you for dinner, and you're sitting in the sand pile out back and not wanting to set aside my trucks, and the name keeps calling, and no matter how long I ignore it, it just is still there. And she's coming for supper, and that's the persistence of it is like that, but it's not separate from me. It is me. My name is me, and I am a creature made by Creator whose size was bigger than all these multiverses that I witnessed. The infinity was so far beyond my capacity, even in this state of being, to comprehend, that it was darkness to me. But the love pouring out of it, and the creation pouring out of it, and myself pouring out of it, that was very visible to me. My name gives me strength in this world as my own identity. And so I live a life here, not attached to myself, my physical self. Let me explain this way. I have long had many nicknames. One of the things all of my friends, they all might call me by one name, Peter or Pete, but many of them have separate names for me. My family too, and I can list them all out for you. I won't, but there's like 10 or 15 of them. All of them refer to me. All of them are spoken by these other people. All of them see me as this other thing. One guy calls me Pebble. One guy calls me Stone. One guy calls me Simon. One guy calls me Pangloss, Peter Pan. And none of these names are me. I allow this to happen. I don't get upset when people mispronounce my last name, Panagore, like I was Italian. But and I don't really care because I'm not my name.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, you describe being in front of like a tunnel with a luminescent, almost like I can't remember how you describe it, like a film kind of thing. And you know that you can pass through this tunnel. You're sort of like in the antechamber. You're in the antechamber to heaven, and you are in heaven, and you're experiencing this joy, this love, this beauty filling you almost to the bursting point, and you know that this is heaven, and you are invited to really like come on in and stay. And you reach out and you I mean, you don't have a body, you don't have a hand, but in some way you touch this film, this portal, and you experience it as life force itself. And then you say, well, I'm going to go back. I have these responsibilities. I want to go back. And you get, I mean, I'll use the word here. You hear, well, you say you want to come back to, I'm going to come back to live my life. And you hear, you will not live your life.
Yep.
And when I read that at first, I thought, well, you will not live your small self life. You will live like my life. The divine says, you will live my life. But it almost seemed like a double entendre to me, because when you came back, it's as though you almost instantly recognized that you'd made a mistake, that this world is flat and drab and ugly in comparison to what you had experienced. And from that moment on, all you wanted was to return. So when I went back and I was thinking about that phrase, you will not live your life, I also heard, you will not live your life. You know, it will feel flat to you in that dimension. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the coming back and the integrating and the loneliness of that, because you didn't talk about this for many years. This was your secret. And I think that's one thing that maybe a lot of people don't understand about mystical experiences in general, or awakening, like really profound experiences, how they can be both this ecstasy of union and this intensely alone experience on the human plane. So could you speak a little bit about that, what it has been like to live your life against this backdrop of that experience, and to try to embody or be in both of those worlds? What has that been like for you?
Well, it's better now, but it hasn't always been better. And as soon as I came back, I lived in two worlds. I was bilocated, but the most of me wasn't here. Most of me was there, but it was obscured to me here.
Yeah.
I knew that I wasn't at all who I had been. It wasn't just that I was going to live this expansive life of the realization of the divine here. It's that I was no longer who I had always been.
Yeah.
And so I lost my identity. I had a new identity, but I didn't know who I was anymore here. I knew who I was there, but I didn't know here. And yet here I was inside this body with all these memories and all these people who think I'm the same guy, and I am entirely not. Mm-hmm. And I learned early, because you mentioned that I had mystical experiences as a child, and I learned very young, about 5, to keep my mouth shut about it, because it was safer that way. And then I had this experience in my family where my sister had run away or vanished from our point of view, where the family was forced into silence about her disappearance to everybody, including cousins. So I was well practiced at keeping things to myself. So I realized that I was never, ever going to be able to explain what I was seeing to people, or they think I was crazy. Mm-hmm. So I immediately shut my trap. And on the second morning, the first morning is the day that we survived, but the second morning, I I heard my name roaring inside of me like Niagara Falls, just this huge sound speaking to me without sound and vibrating inside of me, making demands of me to be a messenger, to be a speaker. And I thought, F you. I have no idea. How can I possibly speak this thing that I can't even hear with my human ears? How can I verbalize this? And so I decided that it was safer socially, culturally, familially to shut my mouth. And that's what I did. And so my integration process was strictly on my own.
Yeah.
I was fortunate that I had gone to a Catholic high school, a great Catholic high school, and they were connected to St. Joseph's Abbey, which was Thomas Keating, Theophane Boyd, Pemington, those people, the centering prayer practice. But when I learned it in the 70s, it was called contemplative meditation. And I took to it immediately in 77, and I'd been practicing ever since. And this became my interior practice of centering into silence became my anchor point for my interior world, which doubled as an anchor point in this world. And I realized very early on that because I would begin to meditate, almost immediately after this experience, I left on a national theater tour based out of the university, Montana State University, but it was a whole semester. And I isolated myself from the troop in the back of the pickup truck where I traveled 24,000 miles around the U.S., mostly in meditation by myself because I was so disturbed and disrupted. I over my lifetime, I have found that my interior journey is actually strengthens my position in the world. Whenever I tried to fix myself into the world, I failed. But when I drove myself in my interior journey, then I would inch by inch, step by step, find my grounding here more secure. And so I integrated by going interiorly. My entire life changed. I was an English major, headed to graduate school in architecture, in the family business, which is what my sister was in graduate school for the moment at that time, with the same family plan. And I decided I couldn't do that. I looked at the monastery and decided I'd been visited there, experienced the radiance of the monks and their practice. They were the first people who actually I could see so clearly the light inside of them and around them, which was super attractive to me. But I decided that I needed sex in my life, and I was afraid of the monastic life. So I went to divinity school, where I studied, like every other MDiv, everything you had to study, but my dean of students allowed me to 3-year independent study of mysticism. And so I dove deep into Western classical mysticism in order to find tool sets and languages to describe to myself what had happened to me, and tool sets to use in my interior practice. Before I got to divinity school, one last thing, I was at UMass Amherst studying mime in addition, because I was doing theater, in the school of Marcel Marceau, who taught Hatha Yoga. And Hatha Yoga introduced me to my chi, to my chakras, which led me to the Yoga Sutras, Paramahansa Yogananda, and a 40-year practice of interior Kriya Yoga in combination. So my entire reintegration process was interior.
Yeah.
And what I found was that the deeper I went inside myself, the more likely I was able to, and this was the mystics talk about this, the more I'm more well positioned for another experience of divine grace. No guarantee of that. Okay? No guarantee. But at least I'd be positioned for this. And I have found that this practice of my interior life, the thinning of the veil, as it were, and the availability to grace, it's been the divine grace that has infilled me and uplifted me and brought me into other mystical experiences that have resulted in my real integration here, culminating with my last mystical experience, well, second to last now, in 2015 when I died again. And so my integration process was entirely based on a study of the life of the ancient mystics. And the reason why I chose them instead of modern mystics is because I figured the Yoga Sutras, Panagore, it's been handed down for 3,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I figured that if anybody was going to have the lowdown on how to do this, it's going to be the mystical geniuses of the history of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
That's how and so now, okay, this is an extraordinarily lonely process. I lied through my whole life, okay? It's so lonely that I lied. I lied in my ordination. You go before the ecclesiastical council. I lied in my ecclesiastical council because I am not a believer. I do not believe. I haven't believed since I came back. I know who I am. I know where I'm from. I know what I am here, and it doesn't fit into theology very well. So
Yeah.
I then lied through my whole time as a clergy person. Everybody thought I was a believer, and I wasn't.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about that in your book, how the first time you publicly told your story was in front of your congregation, very spontaneously. That morning, somebody asked you about, how did your faith sustain you through all this congregational turmoil? And you stood up and you spoke your story. And you said, I don't have faith. This person was asking about your faith. You said, I don't have faith. I know. I know. And if we know in that existential way, then belief, what is belief? It doesn't, it's a totally different thing. I'd like to read something that, from your book about, did you sense that when you went to Yale Divinity School and you focused on the mystics, did you feel like you had found your spiritual kindreds?
They're my peer group, my buddies, my good friends.
Yeah.
They're all dead, of course. But no, I had no other peer group. I was the oddball at the divinity school. I never went to chapel. 3 years, I went one day. And I went that one day. I ended up getting a job that day as a result of being there. But I always went off by myself and meditated. My peers, they didn't get that. Why was I doing that? They catch me in the chapel downstairs, standing on my head doing yoga. I got thrown out of the library one day just because I was standing on my head doing yoga in the back. I got kicked out for a week.
Oh my gosh.
So it was, but my peer group, and it wasn't just Teresa of Avila and Meister Eckhart and Rumi and Rusbrook. It was Lao Tzu and Panagore and all of these people who talk about the oneness of being, the singleness, the end of self-identity, the ecstasy of the cloud of unknowing, the end of the knowledge of self. This is who I am. That's what I experienced, and so I had told one of my buddies, who saw the change, one from my childhood buddy, and he saw the change in me, didn't understand it, but saw the light in me. I then told my wife I say in the book the night before, but I should have had her read it before because she corrected me. That was me. I told her the day after we got married. And unfair of me. But I learned that something happened at divinity school where I had to tell somebody else, and I had this 3-day Kundalini experience where they thought about institutionalizing me. And this has been the problem with mysticism since day one.
Yeah.
You have this experience, you talk about it, people think you're crazy, even if it's a visitation from the dead. And so everybody keeps their mouth shut about it.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons that this center exists, because yes, and we have a spiritual sharing circle where we can talk about these things, because like you're saying, and I've had experiences myself, Kundalini awakenings, and it's like, and we're in a dream, and it's like, oh my God, like everything is sentient and like just blowing my mind. And if you talk about that, people will think you're crazy. And I was a pastor at the time, and I kept my mouth shut about that. I didn't talk publicly about that until after I left the church. So I'm curious, Peter, because you had this experience before you became ordained, even though like that that system didn't really reflect where you were.
Mm.
So what took you in that direction? Does that seem like the only option available?
Yes and yes. Two events. First, my dean, who allowed me this 3-year independent study, who found money to pay for a professor and did all sorts of stuff for me that was outside the norm. She talked me into trying the United Church of Christ because she could see this compassion that I had.
Mm.
And so I made a deal with God for 3 years, at the end of which I was done. I was an associate pastor. I had the best senior minister in the state of Connecticut. This guy, he recruited me. And he's still my friend, okay? He's like my best clergy friend. And other than my peer group, my best older clergy friend. But at the end of 3 years, I was done and out, and I decided to go back to divinity school. No, pardon me, to go back to Yale and to work on my doctorate in mysticism. And I had begun the process by interviewing professors and seeing whether I could do this. And everybody was encouraging to me. And then we got pregnant. And my wife was working on a research project at the Yale Medical School in epidemiology. And when the project was over, because she was pregnant in the 1980s, they wouldn't hire her back. And so I had to, because we were going to stay. Oh, you get a job, we'll have a baby. I'll be I had to get a job. And the only thing I was qualified for was being clergy. So I stayed.
Yeah.
And
because you'd gone to seminary because of your interest in mysticism, and now you're there, and I get the MDiv, and I get the ordination, and I have the job. Right. So that
Yep.
was that. It became a career path, even though you didn't set out for that to be the case.
No, but there was hope because people like Emerson and Thoreau and Blake and Byron and a bunch of other people who I'm not sure about Byron, but I think so. Wordsworth for sure, who had studied at divinity schools and were transcendental romantics. So I thought, oh well, if those guys could do it. And then there was George Herbert. Well, he was a mystic. And he was working in some parish somewhere. I was like, oh, all right, I can probably do this. So I decided to work into my contracts that I had the freedom to. The first time I did this, I worked into my contract that I had the freedom on Tuesday afternoons to go play ultimate frisbee at the divinity school because on the team that I founded. And then I thought, if I can manipulate my contract into that, I can manipulate my contract into meditation and yoga. So I added into my contracts that I would have time for my personal practice.
Yeah.
And so I continued my personal practice because I figured, and I continued my studies. So nobody was looking over my shoulder when I was reading all of the Nag Hammadi texts, all of the non-canonical Acts and Gospels when they were first published. No one was watching me. So I thought I could maintain my disguise while I continued on my path. And so my interior private mystical life was the very only thing that grounded me in the world. And so I continued doing that. Everybody would see me doing yoga and meditating, but they didn't know what it meant. Working my chakras, working my subtle body, entering into silence. So it became a pretty good cover for me. So I was like God's secret agent in the church is how I thought of myself. And my near-death experience gave me superpowers. I have superpowers. And one of my superpowers, I know who I am. I know where I'm from. You can't really hurt me. You can hurt my feelings. You can wound me financially, but you can't touch the core of my being. I know who I am. And so there was this huge embezzlement in the church by an embezzler who was operating elsewhere in the town, which had followed upon the heels of another embezzlement in the church. By the time I got there, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I became the target. And so I resigned twice in this church within 18 weeks because I could see what was going on. I didn't know what the problem was, but I was prevailed upon to stay, and so I stayed 11 years. During which time, the people who were behaving poorly in the church set out to destroy me as a person, societally, culturally, financially, pastorally, tried to get me defrocked, all sorts of stuff. At the end of which, after we endured it all and succeeded in rooting it all out, all the darkness, like Walter Wink, I don't know if you read Walter Wink's books, like Walter Wink, who was helpful to me. when I finally knew that they trusted me, that's how I ended up telling them the truth.
Because they didn't understand how you could have endured all of that.
Oh, it was New England-wide news. It was big.
Wow.
It was hard.
Yeah.
But one of the things about near-death experience is it doesn't separate you from your emotions.
Yeah.
You're still a human being, and you still can be hurt, but you can't touch my core. So I then got recruited into television, and because I had opened the door. I began playing around in television, trying to explore this topic. I had a 2-minute show, and I explored this topic, and I became more comfortable and more comfortable and more comfortable, and I continued going deeper and deeper inside myself. And the loneliness continued, even though I was meeting other NDEers, near-death experiencers, but we were very few, mostly because the people that I love the most in the world can't see what I see, and so don't really understand me. And so part of the loneliness of this is having to learn to adjust oneself to their world.
Yes.
And that is a universal mystical problem. It's not just near-death experiencers. And I should throw this in here too, is that many of you have read Varieties of Religious Experience by William James as 4 characteristics of mystical experience. Near-death experience fits inside that rubric. My mystical experiences that might be similar to the mystical experiences like of yore, and the mystical experiences of visitation from the dead and near death, they're all touching the divine. And once you touch the divine and a Kundalini type experience or anything like that, you now know something you can't ever say. You can try.
And you can't ever unknow it either.
You can't ever unknow it.
You can't ever unknow it, and you can't ever describe it. Which brings me back to this passage that I'd like to read from your book. And this is, you're talking about, I'm compelled to talk about it now, yet paradoxically, I know no words can convey it.
Yeah.
This no thing, and that's what you experienced in this near-death experience. You experienced the no thingness. This no thing is so present to me now as I write that it overwhelms me. I cannot escape it. This overwhelming feeling has filled my days every day, ever since that night. In the years since my death, I have done my best to say what cannot be said, to articulate what cannot be articulated, to describe what cannot be described, and think about what cannot be thought about. God is no thing. I repeat, God is no thing. God is not a thing. Anything that can be said about God is inaccurate. Words are things. God is not. God cannot be explained, contained, described, or even seen. And Peter, as I read that passage, I immediately thought about what you're up to now, which is not church, because religion is a thing. Our concepts about the divine are things. The words that we use to talk about it all are things. And now you are involved in this not thing that is not church. So tell us about what that is and what your vision is, and tell us about it.
Well, I took hope from Dionysius the Agrippid, who was a early mystic in the Christian tradition who talked about the negative theology, which is what you just described, the no thingness of the divine. When I was a UCC minister, I never encountered a single other mystic in the church. Never once. Nobody. And I know that they're there, but I found that there was a fundamental misunderstanding. Let me back up and say that when I went to Catholic high school, every year we read a gospel. So by the time I graduated high school, I was familiar with Jesus. So when I died and came back, the man that I read in the books no longer looked like the guy that I learned about in high school, because he spoke in metaphor and simile, and he talked about light and love, these things that were true and real to me, the only reality. But I think that they made a fundamental mistake at the Council of Nicaea, where they deified him.
Mm-hmm.
And that from that choice on, the containment by theologians of mysticism, they were not mystics, they were theologians, they like philosophers, brilliant people. Philosophy is important, but it's not mysticism. So I spent all these years in the church and reading all these other materials, including the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, all these other materials, very far and wide. And I tried to figure out what I was going to do with myself after my TV show ended. What am I going to do? You know, nobody's there. I could go back in the church, but to me, it all looked like darkness from where I stood. So I decided to deconstruct, but not traditional. Deconstruction I started learning deconstruction in high school in the 70s when we started pulling apart poetry. Literature, literary people who study English know about deconstruction because that's how you study literature. And then there's divinity school that taught deconstruction. The kind of deconstruction I'm doing now isn't that sort of deconstruction. I'm trying to deconstruct the idea that what Jesus said, or reconstruct it as metaphor and reconstruct it as simile. I don't actually do a lot of deconstruction. I just assume that. And I try to unpack the language of Jesus through the lens of near-death experience. And so I spent 2 years with my show, Not Church, under my name, Peter Panagore, as a channel, setting this up, talking about metaphor and symbol and myth in the Bible, and poking around into the words of Jesus so that I could get to the Gospel of Thomas. So I've been going through the Gospel of Thomas, which is if you haven't read the Gospel of Thomas, I highly recommend it. It comes from a Syrian monastery where it was discovered in 1945, more or less the same time as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Kind of gets mixed up in that. But there are fragments of it that were discovered in the late 1890s, north of the pyramids, where there are Coptic fragments in this big, huge find that match what's in this complete Coptic book called the Gospel of Thomas. Because in this book, Jesus is allowed to speak as a mystic. Mm-hmm. And through the study of this book, through this lens, so what I'm trying to do is use this lens to then go back and look at the other gospel stories and biblical stories so that people can see the light inside them that Jesus was actually communicating. All of this is just head knowledge. This is to help people who are trying to deprogram themselves, to help them deprogram. But it has almost nothing to do with the divine presence itself. The divine presence itself is transcendent and immanent experience of direct possibility. So what I've been really doing in Not Church, I'm using Not Church and Mystic Tea Salon, this global conversation of mystics from around the world. That's the target. Not Church supports Mystic Tea Salon. But all of this is just head knowledge. It's really about the development of the interior practice of silence and subtle body exploration in order to try to communicate this, to channel it directly. And I took hope from the Pentecost, the tongues of fire. I took hope from Shaktipat, the transference of the divine energy between people. I took hope from Jesus's language, where 2 or 3 are gathered, I am there. This third party presence of multiplier. I took hope from my experience in the monastery, where during the 3 a.m. Gregorian chants, the entire chapel would illuminate like a big bonfire of divine presence, where each one of these individual monks were channeling collectively. And the collective power of the divine light was monstrous, mega size. And then I went to the International Association for Near-Death Studies annual conference, where when I walked in, the combination of the radiance of other near-death experiencers was a very similar magnification of light. So really what I'm trying to do in Not Church is pull together a collective of near-death experiencers and mystical experiencers and seekers who intuit the truth, and put them in a room together, a Zoom or YouTube, and because the divine is no thing and is everything at once and everywhere, to magnify together through our practice of centering prayer, to deepen everyone's individual meditation life, to try to pull down the veils for them inside themselves through this divine sharing of energy so that they don't need me anymore. I really am trying to work myself out of my own job because everybody has this inside them. And if I can do, I've spent my 40 years trying to become a channel of the divine light. That's what I've been trying to do. All this other stuff, it's all dressing. All the languaging, all the preaching, all of that is just the words of it. What I'm really trying to do is show it. And if it can be shown and experienced, then you can, because the light sees itself. You see it in another person because you have it in yourself. And then once you see it in yourself, that's where the cultivation begins. And then there's this cultivation process. Most people, a lot of people don't want to do what the practice takes of diligence and perseverance. But the gifts that arise from this, of the demand or the request of the pursuit of the presence itself, the gifts as the divine presence itself. It's heaven here now. It's this drawing down of the light inside myself so that I can function in the world in a way where I have stability, and then allow this through self-negation to speak for itself through me. I just want to be a vessel. I came back with this command to be a messenger. No words. This is how, for me.
Yeah. Yeah. The direct transmission. And when you and I spoke briefly previously, you talked about the heart, and that is an how does one help the heart awaken in others? How does one help the heart open? How does one help the heart experience its divine radiance, that fire within? And it sounds to me that you are you're doing the head stuff, you're doing the study stuff, but it's just perhaps to satisfy that need that we have. But it's also that's not the that's a thing. So it's not the thing, but it's about this direct inner knowing of oneself and one's light. So, given all that you've experienced, Peter, the mystical experiences that you've had, the near-death experiences that you've had, what is that one thing that you would want to transmit, that you would want to convey to people who may not have these awarenesses that you have?
Well, two things. One, this Shaktipat, this divine energy, so that you see it inside yourself. That's the most important thing. But love, that it doesn't really matter if you meditate the rest of your life or you don't. It doesn't really matter if you find this place inside yourself or you don't. Because in the moment of your death, which is sooner than you think, you'll see for yourself who you really are and what the light is. And that's expressed here through love and kindness, compassion and courage. So love the one you're with. Love the people you're around. Care for them. Some of my most spiritual humanist friends are atheists. Not a drop of belief inside them, but the compassion that lives in their lives. Well, they're still my friends. Because it transcends ideas and belief. And so the one thing is to love. And as for awakening the light inside anyone else, I'm not really trying to do that. That's not my job. My job is to be as radiant as I can be and to shine it. I had not practiced or tried to project it outside myself in my life until people told me that it was happening. I waited, and it was after I died that people in my town, I live in a small town on the coast of Maine, and I've lived here a long time, and it's very community. They started come up to me and telling me that everybody knows this about me, but I can't see it for myself. I had to wait until, and now I'm not trying to open other people's hearts. I'm just trying to show this and let them accept it or not.
Yep.
The thing that matters most is love in all of its suffering and darkness and confusion.
And that was one thing that you realized, that you experienced in your near-death experience, was that love is the treasure that we take with us.
Yes. It opened my eyes to see the light. All the love I'd ever given away, and all the love that was ever given to me, was the lens through which I heard the divine voice speaking to me. No sound. I love you. I've always loved you. I've always known you. I've known you since I made you. No part of you is hidden from me, except my love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Peter, thank you. This has been such an exquisite conversation with you. And I want to, before I ask Joe to come back on for our Q&A, because I want to make sure that our folks have time for that to ask questions. How can people connect with you, with your work? I know that you also do spiritual counseling with people. You've got a new book that's in the process of becoming. You've got a movie project that you're involved with. So share with us what's like happening in your sphere right now and how people can connect with you and what you do.
Well, I'm at peterpanagore.love. That's where you can find all of my links. I run a YouTube channel, and where we talk about on Sunday mornings. Today we deconstructed Matthew 6:22. We're coming up on Thomas 25, I think, in a week or so. But in the meanwhile, next Saturday, I'm flying out to LA to meet with my movie producers for the first time. Heaven is Beautiful has been optioned for a film. I've been working with them for 2 years. This process, it's Act 2 and a 3-act play. I've been having to write Act 1 and Act 3. It's been a relearning of writing process for me. Working with these people has honed my writing skills. That's going to be the 3rd book, and it will hopefully be companion to the movie and much more than the movie can contain. I have a focus, 40 years of pastoral counseling, but I have a focus in grief, suicidality, domestic violence, but most particularly in near-death experience and mystical experience integration. I help people understand who they've become, because every mystical experience gives you a new identity. If it changes your course of life by one single degree, you now know that your beloved deceased is actually still alive in heaven, even though you grieve this person. Your grief changes. By that 1 degree, the course of your life is different. You're a different person. I help people negotiate their new identities. I have a new identity. A month ago at the annual IANS conference, I had a different kind of mystical experience, and I came back a changed person. This born again thing happens again and again and again. So that's peterpanagore.love.
Thank you, Peter, so much for being with us and for sharing all of you with us. And at this point, I would like to ask Joe to come back on. I'm going to turn off my video and microphone. And for the listener, the participants here who are present, you can raise your hand, and Joe will bring you on as a panelist to ask your question, or you can also ask your question in the Q&A. So I'm going to drop off. I'll still be here watching, but thank you again, Peter. It's been really splendid being with you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you very much. Your questions were deep and wonderful. Thank you.
Wow. How do you even say anything following that? Such a powerful, profound, and no-thing conversation. It's an honor, Peter, that you've shared this journey with us. And I guess what strikes me as we move into some Q&A is how, after all of the journey that you describe and have traveled, it comes down to one thing, and that is love. I think what the writings that maybe affected me most when I was going through the traditional theological education in seminary was Kierkegaard, who wrote, "Purity of heart is to will one thing." And also, I think one thing that has attracted me over the decades is the integration of the spiritual mystical journey and even quantum mechanics and quantum physics. Each year, our center puts out a little bookmark as just, thank you and so on and so forth, with maybe a quote or two that we feel is sort of where we are and inspired. And the one that we'll be sending out this fall has a quote: "There's an extremely powerful force for which science has never found an explanation. This universal force is love." Can you guess who said that? Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein, who's the epitome in many ways of science, has just kind of pulled back the curtain and says, with all of his scientific discoveries, that there's one that cannot be explained that's one of the most powerful in the universe. So it is just amazing to have you with us. So we're so grateful. So we're going to open it up now for those of you who are attending. If you have a question, we would love to have you come on and ask the question of Peter. And to do that, you need to click raise your hand, and then we will call on you. So I see we have one question from Christine. So Christine, we're going to ask you to come on. You need to click the little button that says join as a panelist. And then when you do that, you will see that you can turn on your video. There you go. And so turn on your video and unmute, and you'll be able to come on and ask your question of Peter.
Hi there. Can you hear
Christine.
me? Oh,
Yes.
hold on
Hi,
a minute.
Christine.
Oh, there I am.
There you are.
No makeup. I look like crap. Okay. Hi, everybody. So, hi. Nice to meet you. My question has to do with what is love. I don't understand love. I never married. I never had children. I don't have that kind of family love. I worked as a nurse where it wasn't a great loving environment to be a nurse and to give and give and give and give. And I don't get love. So I'd like to, that's my question, is when you talk about it being love. Now, I had a prayer come through me back in 71 that answers that personally to me. But I guess I'm just opening this to how you would explain that. I don't get it.
Well, first off, I would say you embodied love, and you're giving and giving and giving and giving and giving and feeling nothing in return. That's the first thing. There's 10, as many people as there are on earth are experiences of love. Love is this indefinable thing. And I think it's the Upanishads. It recommends against using the word love for the divine. It does this because of the confusion that you just stated. What is this thing? It's 10 million different things. It's the only thing there is that can't be defined. Everything else, every other thing that we have in the world, as far as I know, can be defined. But love, you can't. And yet there's this human universal experience. In your case, it sounds like it was kindness and compassion. And so even though you didn't feel it in return, it's not an emotion that I'm talking about. It can be felt as an emotion, but it can also be felt as pain. It can be felt as grief. It can be felt as loss, sadness, disappointment. All these things are aspects of the experience of love in humanity. I choose to use the word love because it's a universal experience, mostly, and it is often involves selflessness. So a lot of people in my peer group right now are caring for their parents, and they don't really like that they're caring for their parents, but they are caring for their parents. It doesn't have much to do with feeling. It has to do with caring and responsibility. So those are aspects of it. It's indefinable. I choose to use the word love, but as Patricia said and noticed, all of this is just dressing for me. All of this is just a way to try to present this other thing, this inexplicable, unspeakable experience of the numinous. And maybe it comes in a one-time experience in the 70s, and so much so that it leaves a mark inside you that you live your life differently, and you never experience it again. But it's changed the course of your life. And all the people around you, even if you don't have romantic love or a familial love, you gave love. That's the biggest part of it, is giving it away and not expecting anything in return. That's what love is.
Just
Thank
one
you.
more.
Thank
Oh,
you.
I'm sorry.
I just wanted to go ahead and give some others a chance. You know, when I read that quote by Albert Einstein, it made me think that he's using love as the no thing.
Yeah.
The no thing of all existence. And, you know, in a sense, that's almost what, I hear you saying. So let's get on to some other questions. I see we have one from Cliff. Cliff, if you'd click on join as a panelist, and when you do, we'll bring you on and ask you to start your video and unmute.
Hi, Cliff.
Hi, Peter. I've been interested in just watching the church after the pandemic. It seems as though it's a time of rebuilding for the church. And I wondered, almost like after the plague in the 14th century, where you had the mystics then, and is this an opportunity for introducing centering prayer, mindfulness, music sometimes is wordless, all the ways that we can reach for God and God can touch us? Can you talk a little bit about how the church might rebuild itself around that?
Excellent. I tried to do that for my entire pastorate, and not very successfully, I might add. The forward momentum of the juggernaut of the church is difficult to reorient. Anytime a culture needs to change, it often comes through cataclysm. And so, like you said, we had a cataclysm here. Churches are struggling. And I know of a small church in Groton, Connecticut, that has a mystic as a pastor. I've been helping her along for years now. And because of her stalwartness of her interior life, she really is helping the church reorient itself. But it arises from this understanding of selflessness and the practices that she hasn't been able to introduce yet so much. So I think that the 21st century church has an opportunity, but I also think it's kind of past. The church is, the Pew research has been showing for the last 20 years at least, major declines in the church attendance, including the evangelicals now. In the last report, they're not excluded anymore. I think it's because people are missing the very thing that we're talking about. So how to bring this back inside? Well, things need to be broken a little first, because in the breaking, as you all know from your personal experience, when you have suffering and you're broken, that's where the light has the opportunity to get in. But all of that said, I began experimenting. And so before I started Not Church, I toured around New England after my TV show ended. And I spoke in a lot of little churches of all these different denominations. And I came as a well-known near-death experiencer. And in this one little church in upstate Vermont, because there was a mystic who's my friend, who's a member of this Episcopal church, we decided to hold a conversation after church, because I should back up and say that before every time I preached in these churches, I would I would ask the congregation, who here has had a mystical experience? Who here has had a visitation from the dead? Who here has had an angel visitation, or Jesus came to them, or a near-death experience? And nobody would raise their hand until I would raise my hand, and then half the congregation of every single church would raise their hand. And they all turned out to have told somebody, but they never told anybody in church, ever. Like, the one place where you should be able to talk about this was the one place everyone was afraid to talk about this. So with that knowledge, and every church I spoke in, it was about 50% of the people. In this one upstate Vermont church, we decided to hold a conversation after church. And so I had to ask that same question, a series of questions. And then after church, we held a gathering where people felt free and safe to talk about their mystical experiences. That's the first thing I would recommend, is to have people be honest about the reason why they have a spiritual life in the first place. Half these people have had mystical experiences, or what they're being called spiritually transformative experiences, and aren't free to talk about them in church because there are lots of theological impediments. So have a conversation. That's the first thing. And then the meditation life is a practice of diligence. Now, a lot of people don't have the wherewithal to make that pursuit, but to make the connection between the exterior action of social justice, perhaps, feeding the poor, helping the hungry, clothing the naked, all that kind of stuff. There's a direct correlation between these two things. If you want to do help those who need the help, where's that strength of character going to come from? Comes from the interior life. So a technique that could be used is instead of beginning each meeting with, well, Jesus, thanks for being present and doing all this, give me, we want you to do this and do that and the other thing. Begin with silence. Begin with silence. Begin with the gathering in where two or three are gathered, I am there. And dispense with the words and teach the interior life. And yeah, through music, the Gregorian chant, when these voices are, anybody who's ever been in a choir and sung together has had these sorts of revelatory experiences of uplift, or you're doing it wrong, but chances are you have had that experience. So I would love to talk to more churches. My own denomination looks at me with a scratch of the head. What the heck is he talking about? I'm not really associated with the UCC anymore. I left when I went to television. I got tired of hitting my head against the wall. But anybody who's willing to have me talk, count me in, which is why I'm here today. So if you have a church you want to begin this conversation in, invite me in, and I'll talk, and I'll try to help you open the door.
Well, I'll tell you, that's a wonderful example of why the Center for Contemporary Mysticism exists. And that's because about almost 10 years ago, this discussion came up, and a number of people were following along the lines that you're suggesting, one of which was Clifford Cutler, who just asked the question. And so a small group of us began in the church, in this case was an Episcopal church, to ask these questions. Nobody would talk about it, but we got down to saying, has this ever happened to anybody here? Has this? And in a small group, all of a sudden the hands start going up. And so with the leadership of some folks open-minded in the church, and I think with the Spirit, we said, let's just start inviting speakers. Let's start putting out programs. And we had a phenomenal number of people from all across the area, some affiliated with church, some not affiliated with any church, who started showing up for this. And like almost 10 years later, we have friends and members of over 1,700 people across the U.S. and in other countries that are doing the sort of things you're talking about, Peter. So it's a very exciting, and I'm so happy to hear that you're opening yourself up to start these conversations in other churches, because it happened in Philadelphia. in a church that was just willing to be open-minded and start asking the questions and then being silent and taking it from there. So it's very exciting. So I want to keep going with some questions. I see we do have a question from Michael. Michael, if you would come on board and click the join as the panelist button, and we would love to have you come on board and ask your question. You'll need to start your video. There you are, and unmute. So Michael, ask your question.
Okay. Yeah, two things. Are you familiar with a Smithsonian book that Thomas Jefferson wrote, which edits out all of the miracles and focuses on what I assume is the mysticism?
Yes, I'm familiar with it. I've read it.
Okay, well, that's kind of like, the philosophers wanted us to follow it one way, and the mystics perhaps just want to go to the mystical. Now, the second thing is, while you were talking, I heard music in the background. The Beatles. All you need is love. Love is all you need. But more importantly was the song, Nothing's Gonna Change My World. Nothing's gonna change my world. Now, again, nothing could be, no thing is going to change my world. And the little I studied about Buddhism, they talk about the nothingness that I think you were talking about. Is that right? And are the Beatles the love we're talking about?
I think so.
Good. No, that's all I wanted to share with you. And it's been eye lifting. Yeah. Yeah. Were you an altar boy too?
No, I was not. I was in the Boston diocese, though. Thank God I wasn't an altar boy.
Okay. All right.
But I have to say this. I'll say this one thing, though, that about that Boston diocese is that one day I was talking in this little tiny church outside of Boston, and in the audience was this priest, and I sat down next to him. He was my priest as a kid, and he was not a pedophile. He was actually a mystic.
Wow. Wow. Bless you.
Yep.
Thank you very much for your meeting with the group here. This is the greatest group that I've ever been affiliated with, except for my doo-wop group that I used to sing with. And, we touched heaven sometimes with the harmony.
Of course.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I wanted to get on. I saw we had another hand raised. Let me go here. There's one from Linda. So Linda, if you would come on board, we would ask you to click on the button that says join as a panelist. And let me see if I can find you there. There you are. And start your video, and you'll be able to ask Peter your question. And unmute. Remember to unmute. There you go.
Thank you. I would like to ask how your practice of yoga has impacted your journey.
Oh, majorly.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So Jesus is very descriptive about what, but very short on how. And so my yoga practice is physical, but it's primarily not physical. The primary aspect of my yoga practice is Kriya Yoga. It's a practice of using my breath to find my subtle body. And so I have spent most of my adult life in this practice, using my physical yoga, my hatha. I started out with hatha. I've had lots of Iyengar and Ashtanga, lots of yoga forms, techniques. But all of them have to do with using my physical body. So in yoga, physical yoga practice, there's basically two things going on with your body. There's contraction and relaxation. And using the contraction and the relaxation as a focus for my mind, focusing on the muscular structure of my body, gives me the mental capacity to leave my mind inside my body without thought, without ideas. And taking that same technique, instead of moving into my chakras, into where I thought my chakras should be, I could feel them because of this thing that happened to me in my within 6 months of my return. I knew that they were real. I could feel their energy forms, but I didn't want to get messed up in ideas about them, imaginations about them, because they were real to me and they were not imaginations. They were not ideas. They were energy forms. And so I would take my mind and put my mind inside my heart chakra, for instance, and breathe it down to the balls of my feet and when I'm in downward dog. Or I start up in my third eye and breathe it across my spine and down to my feet. So I used my breath and my body in the same way I use my my mantra, my prayer chant, and my breath in my centering prayer practice. I just used my body instead of my prayer chant. And so what this practice has done for me over all of these years is I have what they call opened my chakras, which is not, in my experience, a very accurate way of describing what happens, so much as getting out of the way of what's already there. And by focusing my mind inside of each one of them and then linking them through my breath and running channels in all my yoga forms. If you're a yogi, you know that you get in all these crazy twisty forms, but there are chakras all through your body. It's not just these seven. And by linking them together, I have my experience when I came back was that I am much larger than my physical body. I'm living I enter my soul, my consciousness came back into my body, but my first experience was that my body was inside my soul. Like I'm out here and my body's inside it. And so a large part of my practice has been utilizing the prana, the chi, in order to make it large enough for me to have a bubble to live within so that I could have heaven in my own experience here. So it has so changed my interior practice that I have found, and this is where I broke with Christianity early on, is that I've been digging my way back to heaven. That's what this is. That's what chakra practice is for me. The practice of yoga is pulling back the veil layer by layer by layer, in combination with the practice of entering into silence. So I have these two practices that I practice together. And at the end of my yoga practice, I go into silence because I've already juiced myself up energetically. So I've been working with my prana or my chi or whatever you want to call this divine energy in order to make myself a channel. That's what it's really done for me. But originally, the channel wasn't to show. The channel was to survive here. That's what it gave me initially, was a much deeper connection to the radiance itself in a physical sort of way. It like all practices takes practice. That's why it's called a practice. And it is effective. Kept my mouth shut about it until it became visible. But basically, this is it. I use my mind and my breath inside my body without ideas.
Wow. Thank you, Linda, for that question.
Thank you so much.
You're
welcome.
It reminds me of Eckhart Tolle was asked recently, I think, what he considers the accomplishment of his life, and he simply said, "I've learned to not think."
Yeah, that is it. That's a hard thing to do.
That is a very hard one.
But
I want to take time for a couple of more questions. There's one from Catherine. I'll see, Catherine, if you can come on. If you would click the join as a panelist button, and we can bring you on to ask a question of Peter. Let me see. There you are. And start your video. And unmute.
There we go. I wanted to ask a follow-up question to Christine's question before. I thought he was giving a really good feedback, but I felt like I just want to hear like the next thought, like how does she refill her cup when you're exhausted? Because I think a lot of us are going through this in life for one reason or another. Maybe it's the age we are, but when you're empty and you're, for whatever reason, people in your life are not able to help you fill your cup and give you what you need, how do you navigate that? How do you maintain those relationships in a way that they're comfortable with, but still meeting your own personal needs?
Well, my deepest need, that's a really good question. My deepest need is for the divine. And so I've been refilling my own cup my whole life. I found that my biggest problem was that I already had a beloved now. As soon as I came back, my beloved is always the divine, and there was nothing here ever going to fill me up, ever. And so I was bereft of this one thing, this no thing. And so my way to negotiate my human relationships is the same way I use to negotiate my emptiness. I pursue the oneness of being. And I find that in the pursuit of the oneness of being, I opened up my tap up here just to trickle, and then more and more and more and more over more time, so that I fill myself. That's how I do it. I fill myself. It's not with my water. I open the tap. That's all I do. The water is its own. But in terms of my personal relationships, it comes with compassion and kindness. My wife and I, we've been married a long time now. I don't fill all her needs, and she doesn't fill this primary need for me, which has been very difficult for her. She knows this about me, but she fills other needs in my life. And I fill other people's needs, those sorts of physical things, but not physical, but like, mowing the yard and caring for the kids kind of stuff, and doing the grocery shopping and all that, cleaning the bathroom. But in terms of my emotional needs, my emotional and my psychological and my most intimate needs, nobody can touch those things. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They're all connected to this one singleness. And that's one of the curses of this experience. Mm-hmm. I used to talk about blessings and curses. I don't talk about that much because people don't really want to hear about the downside. But there's a big downside, and there's this depersonalization that happens. It's not just depersonalized from the world, it's from people. I see them as creatures, just like I see myself. So how have I negotiated my interpersonal relationships? Well, I don't talk sports, so that kind of eliminates all the friends who want to talk about sports. But you want to talk to me about real things, I'll talk to anybody about real things. So in terms of my family, my mom and my dad and my brother, I'm the one that we talk about real things with. I have never found anything here that fills me. Nothing. I'm sorry to my wife, and she knows this is true. Or my kids. My kids, when I came out. So when I came out, my kids, I think my daughter was in 8th grade and my son was in like 5th, something like that, or 6th and 9th or something. And what they heard from me was that Dad doesn't love us enough to want to stay alive. Dad would rather pray for his own death. It really damaged my relationship with my kids. They thought that I didn't love them. So I've spent a good part of the next 10 years trying to convince them to understand that I do love them. I can't be the father that they wanted me to be. I can only be who I am, and the same is true in all my relationships. I can only be who I am. And I fill my cup, my sports cup, with my buddies who are sporty. Like, I might not talk sports, but put me on a bike or going skiing or sailing, I'm all in. I fill my cup. My wife can't do that for me. I fill my cup with other people in my physical world, but in my interior world, I only got one source. And I found that the deeper, I've said this before in the last hour, the deeper I go inside myself, the more stability I have inside the world. And at the end of the day, if I was a nurse, a doctor, a clergy person, a counselor, a firefighter, a police officer, people who give of themselves to their community, I found that the only way I could refill myself was by going on the inside. And that's what I do in my relationships too. I spend enough time in my personal interior life to be able to give to those who can't see what I see. I love them as they are. I love people for who they are as they are, and not really try to change them or make them into something else, including someone who understands me.
Thank you so much for sharing the balance and juxtaposition of the inner life and the outer life, because I think so often we struggle with that. Was it one of the Desert Fathers who said, what did I do before enlightenment? I chopped wood and carried water. What did I do after enlightenment? I chop wood and carry water. We could almost update it today by saying, before or after enlightenment, I take out the garbage and I wash dishes. But that, for me, and I think for many, is a challenge, to balance that out in a caring, loving way, to pursue that inner love of the divine with as much as possible not being hurtful to others. And it's encouraging that you share that part of the journey. I think to me is very, very helpful. We have another question I see from Raymond. Raymond, if you would click on the join the panelist button, we would have you come on and maybe ask a question of Peter.
And as he comes on, Joe, I'm going to add and say that I chose the career that I chose studying mysticism because otherwise I was going to do nothing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Raymond, if you would come on and unmute, we would love to hear your question of Peter.
Am I on?
Yep.
Yes.
I think you are. We lost your
okay. Let's see, what do I do with the video here?
Should be able to click a button there.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. Well, so much of this resonates. I thank you. I was also struck by your arrival and acceptance of not being understood, and some of the aloneness and loneliness that is connected with that. My question to you is, are you able to describe an experience of the gift of tears along this pathway?
Yeah, so in 2016, I went back to where I died. Someone had found out that I had never been back. I never wanted to go back because to me it was a place of trauma. But she decided that it was important for me to go back, and so she paid my way. Tickets, airline tickets, car rental, hotels, food for a week. And when I was there, through the help of some Native American traditional spirituality, I was able to face my trauma and cry for a long time for my own grief. And those tears are the reason I don't cry now every time I tell my story. Up until 2016, every time I told it, I cried and cried and cried, but it wasn't a good cry. It was a wounded cry. And now, because of that experience of this re-entering my pain, those tears, they cleansed me. Not completely, but they cleansed me. I've cried a lot. I don't cry over spilt milk, and I don't cry over grief much because I know where people are. But I have cried a lot over trauma. And it's always been freeing for me and releasing for me. It was helping me tell my story so that I would be less bottled up. Keeping silent about it was hard. But I find that those tears in 2016 were a relief and a release for me. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful to those who helped me do it.
Thank you, Raymond, for that excellent question. Well, I'm going to ask Patricia if she would come back on, and I want to say thank you to her along with Peter for this conversation and program. I don't even know how to put words on it, but it's just so amazing that we've had the opportunity to share this with you, Peter, and we're honored and grateful that you've chosen to do this. Before we let you go, I was going to ask if you want to have anything to say about maybe what's next for you. You've talked a little about the movie, and we should let people know you are in the process of writing your third book, I believe. Tell us a little about, what's next, books, the movie, or anything going on with Not Church.
Well, the book is. I came out as a near-death experiencer publicly because I thought it was safer than coming out as a mystic.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was a bunch of near-death experiencers coming out, Eben Alexander, Anita Moorjani, all these people who were kind of in the tier right ahead of me. But I was a mystic before I was an NDEer. And so this book is going to be tracing my mystical experiences. And my whole purpose in coming out with these things is to help try to normalize it in the public square so that people can talk about it over cocktails or at the Red Sox game or at on the subway, so that it becomes a normalized conversation among people of all sorts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's going on there, and that's part of the movie. I've had to write a little bit for what amounts to Act 1 and Act 3 for the movie, from my real life experience. Not Church. It's going to continue on as long as people continue to generously support my process and help feed them. I teach meditation a couple days a week live. Not Church. We're just going to continue exploring Thomas and look for the mystical Jesus in the Gospels. That's an ongoing process, and so far so good.
Well, that sounds great, and you can learn more about Peter at his website. I think we've already mentioned that, which is simply peterpanagore.love. I like that. I only recently learned that was a new domain name. We're familiar with .com and .org, and I thought maybe there is hope for this world if you have a domain .love. So we encourage people to check out his website, which is full of all sorts of resources and ways to get in touch with him. We also want to thank Patricia again for her wonderful, gifted interview that she always comes through. This has been a game changer in a lot of ways. I think just wonderful, Patricia. So thank you. And you can find out more about her at her website, patriciapierce.com. It's spelled Pearce. She has a We Awakening podcast, which is a wonderful podcast that's worth checking out, plus her books and her companion groups. And then be sure and check into the contemporarymysticism.org, our own website, to learn about upcoming folks in the months ahead. We have Penny Gill coming back, Matthew Fox, Jeffrey Olson, as you mentioned, Eben Alexander, who was around 10 years ago when we actually started the Center for Contemporary Mysticism. And following in some of the things that were a theme today, next month, for those in the Philadelphia area or close enough to travel, we're going to have an all-day contemplative retreat on silence and stillness. And so we're looking forward to that. So you can check all of those out at contemporarymysticism.org. So thank you again, Peter. It was really our honor, and we hope that you'll consider yourself a part of the Center family, and we'll have an opportunity to be together again. So until we meet again, we'll say stay safe, be well, and remember that you are perfect exactly as you are. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you all.
Blessings.